Well, hello and welcome along. I'm Justin Brierley. This is Lucy Brierley, and John Lennox is joining us as well on the line now. I'm really pleased to say that we're bringing you John Lennox tonight on a special live stream edition of Unbelievable, a Q&A. Yes, we're really excited.
We're really excited. Yes.
And the technology again all seems to be working, which is wonderful. We're actually broadcasting across several Facebook pages tonight simultaneously. So a very big thank you to everyone who is hosting this, and we want to hear from as many people as possible this evening as well. So wherever you are, whichever time zone you're in, please do send your questions in the comments wherever you're watching this Facebook Live video. Well, John Lennox hardly needs any introduction, but he is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at the University of Oxford and a renowned Christian thinker, speaker and author. And he's been a frequent guest on the Unbelievable show over the years. So John, welcome along to the program. Thank you for joining us. How are things with you at the moment?
They're very good, thanks. But I'm always delighted to be involved with Unbelievable in many of its different aspects.
It's great to have you back on the show. This time very much taking questions from viewers and listeners. But I know you've probably been asked this question over 100 times already, but how have you and Sally coped with the lockdown thus far?
Well, extraordinarily well, really. We're elderly, as anyone can see, and we're in that vulnerable class. And so for the last 3 or 4 months, we have been locked down and just going out when we need to, having groceries delivered and so on. But what has happened is this: I'm doing very much less travel, and so I can concentrate on writing. And it's been an extremely productive time because I've been able to use the daytimes and sometimes part of the nighttime to update books, write new ones, and all this kind of stuff. So from a very selfish perspective, it has been extremely productive.
Well, it's great to have you with us. We're going to talk about some of the recent books that you've been writing and publishing. But first, a quick introduction to us for those who perhaps are not familiar. I'm Justin. I host the Unbelievable show. It's a weekly sort of dialogue and debate show that goes out on podcast, video and radio. Lucy is my wife. She's the minister of the church here in Surrey, where we live.
Yes.
So it's great. This is maybe the second or third time I've had you on the show now.
Yes,
Luce.
I've never been so involved with your work before, but now we're doing everything from home. Everything is kind of merged together. We're doing church, family, work, everything in one small space.
Absolutely. Now, just a quick advert. I'm going to actually share a screen so that you can see this as well. Unbelievable. If you've never come across the show and you want to find out more about it, and perhaps you've actually have come across the show, but you've never subscribed to our newsletter, then can I encourage you to do so? We've got a special offer right now. In fact, if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll obviously get the latest news and content from the show, but we'll also send you my free ebook. It's called In Conversation With. You should be able to see it on the screen there, in which I share some of the interviews and encounters I've had with people like Jordan Peterson, Tim Keller, Richard Dawkins, and many other significant thinkers. So there's a link in the description of this Facebook video where you can sign up for the newsletter. You'll get that free ebook, and of course you'll get notified of events like this and lots of other good stuff on a fortnightly basis. Now, Lucy and I are going to be talking as well with John about some of his recent books. He's got some great new books out. Firstly, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? And his most recent book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. Again, there's a link to that in the description of this video where you can get a copy in the info. So do go and get hold of that book. I've got a special connection, which I'll reveal in a moment, with the book as well myself. Lucy and I are going to begin by talking to John a little bit about these two most recent books, but we want to pretty quickly move to your questions as well. And this is very much an open forum as far as we see it, whether you consider yourself a Christian or a skeptic or a seeker or something else, you are welcome to ask a question. It could be theological, scientific, something about the pandemic, about doubts about atheism, Christianity, the Bible, the future of technology and AI. All questions are welcome, basically. And John will do his very best, coming to them completely blind to answer them. So again, just do that by simply leaving a question in the comments wherever you're watching this video. And my very helpful assistant, again, Peter Byram, will be compiling and sending those questions through for Lucy and I to fire at John. So try to keep them short and sweet would be my only suggestion, and you might have more luck getting yours asked. So let's talk about some of what you've been writing and publishing recently, John. I mean, again, where is God in a coronavirus world? That came out very promptly, not long after lockdown had begun, really. How did it come together so fast? Could you remind us about that?
When the coronavirus pandemic started, the mathematician in me saw immediately that it would go global with exponential speed. And it simply occurred to me, this is going to be very scary. It's going to raise the kind of question that earthquakes and catastrophes raise, but on a huge scale. And I thought, here I am in lockdown. Can I do anything? And I believe as a Christian that Christianity actually has something to say into this kind of situation that's not simplistic, that's not trivial. And I thought, let me try and write something at least that might be an encouragement to my Christian friends, and also might stimulate thought and discussion among people who may be searching for answers and thinking, as we all do, about these big questions. So I sat down and wrote for a week. I sent it to a publisher on a Saturday night, and by Wednesday it was in print, and it's now in 27 languages.
Gosh, that is extraordinary. I mean, I would say our experience has been just a local level, you know, with the church and so on. Having to go online because of the coronavirus pandemic has really changed the way we think about church, and in as funny ways has opened us up to the realization that there are a lot of people because of this unusual time who are searching for answers and questions and joining us on our Facebook feeds for our Sunday services. People we may never have imagined would actually be turning up on a regular basis like that. So it is provoking, I think, quite deep questions in people, isn't it?
Oh, that's absolutely right. And I think this is, when you reflect on it, what you might expect, that things on this scale immediately remind people, if they needed reminding, that they're vulnerable, and then that they're mortal. And once you start thinking about death, it is inevitable that you think about eternity and God and so on. And I suspect you've found, as many people have found, not only in the UK but elsewhere, that the church audience has multiplied greatly because it's gone online. So I think your analysis is correct. It's acting like C.S. Lewis said years ago, pain is God's megaphone. It's at least saying to the world, look, you need to think about the big picture. Have you got a framework big enough to cope with it?
Yeah, and I think just speaking as a leader of a church, the very nature of church and what it means and what it looks like has changed so dramatically, because we can no longer gather together physically, which is something so very precious to us. And I wonder, how are you finding your relationship with God and your own personal spiritual growth and development is existing in this type of isolation that we have, where we can't gather physically with our sisters and brothers in Christ?
I haven't sensed the isolation too greatly because, first of all, I've got good fellowship with my wife here. We pray and read together, which is always a very solid base for married life. But secondly, I've had so many interactions around the world. I think since lockdown, this is about the 110th major interview I've had. Wow. So there's been a great deal of contact with all kinds of groups of people. So I haven't felt remote at all. But of course, it's fair to say that since I was very young, I was able to cope with my own company. And I've just enjoyed all that time for reflection and reading. And so in a sense, the presence of God has been more real than ever because a lot of the busyness has been taken out of life. And on reflection, one sees that so many things are just not necessary. So it's reorientating an attitude towards life itself.
Yeah. Let's talk about your latest book, John, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity. As I mentioned, there is a link to it from the description of this video. Obviously, you've been working on that book quite a lot longer than you kind of worked on the coronavirus book. Why now? And tell us about the title as well. What does 2084 actually refer to?
Well, 2084 is really a takeoff of the book called 1984 that George Orwell wrote, and in which he introduced Big Brother and this kind of thing. And artificial intelligence these days is connected with surveillance technologies. And they weren't realized in 1984, but they're here with a vengeance today. And they've got their upside and their downside. And because I have, for most of my life, been interested in two big questions. The first, what is the status of this universe? Is it created or not? And what is the status of human life? Is it made in the image of God or not? And what I noticed increasingly was, with the rapid development of bioengineering and cybernetic and cyborg technologies, there's much more in the thinking spectrum, so to speak, about what we should do with humanity. And we're probably the first generation that is able to think seriously of doing something, say by modifying the human constitution, by altering the germline. And having read C.S. Lewis many years ago, and he interested me greatly in two of his books, The Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, where he talked about the extreme risk associated with allowing a bunch of scientists to try and produce a transhuman in the language we use today. And when I read Harari's book, Homo Deus, I thought, I need to really get into this and write something, because again, I feel many atheists are writing about this stuff. Why don't I, as a Christian, say something about it? Because we can understand, in a sense, what the technology does, even if we haven't developed it ourselves. And we can certainly introduce to a thinking public its significance, what philosophies and worldviews are driving it and being produced by it. So all of that went together, and I was invited to give a lecture in London to a group of church leaders, which seemed to go extraordinarily well, and that provided a little bit of an impulse to do it. But you're right, I've been working very hard on it for quite a while.
I'm more familiar with that book than most I read ahead of a show, because I actually had the privilege of being the narrator for the audiobook.
Well, thank you very much for doing that.
So it's my voice you'll hear rather than John's if you choose to download the audible version of it. But what I really appreciated about the book was that it was such a great overview of the whole area. So for people who are perhaps new to all of the issues involved with artificial intelligence and so on, it'll be a very helpful primer, but also really looks at the spiritual dimension of what's going on. You mentioned already Yuval Noah Harari and his book, Homo Deus. That has been a huge bestseller and really sketches out a future where he believes that humans will effectively be replaced or upgraded, let's say, by technology. But I don't think you find his outlook, his worldview, very appealing, do you, John?
I don't find it appealing, and I'm not sure that he finds it completely appealing. I think he sees difficulty within it himself, but I don't find it appealing, and I think C.S. Lewis put his finger on it. He said, if eventually scientists, and I'm paraphrasing now, produce something like uploading a brain onto silicon, what they will produce is not a human, but an artifact, so that the final triumph of science will be the abolition of man. And that's quite a chilling thought. And it's even more chilling when you find some of our leading thinkers reflecting that kind of thing. Lord Rees is an example of that, and he talks about in the future that the intelligences will be so different from what they are today, and he comes to the conclusion that we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of the way we behaved. Now, when the Astronomer Royal talks like that, that's very different from Harari, who's a historian talking about it. And there are serious thinkers who believe that we're going to go there, and they're warning of the huge dangers of it. And it's a big ethical issue. And the big problem with both narrow AI of the surveillance technology type and artificial general intelligence is the technology outpaces the ethics.
John, I had an experience recently which unnerved me somewhat. We have an Alexa in our kitchen, and some time ago we had some friends to stay who had a new puppy. So all of the conversation was surrounding dogs and puppies and all of the new things they bought for this puppy. And then the next minute I find that in my Facebook feed I'm seeing adverts for everything puppy related, having never searched at all for anything myself. This was just what was happening in our home and the conversations we were having. I mean, are they listening to us?
Oh yes, and this is a very important element, and I discuss it in the book. It's called surveillance capitalism, and it's a subject of a brilliant book by Shoshana Zuboff, who's an emeritus professor at MIT. But the point of it is this: Alexa, a smartphone, we voluntarily put these things in our homes or in our pockets. And what they're doing is harvesting information. And some of that we find very useful. I have a book here, The History of Mathematics. I ordered it 2 days ago and it appeared the next day. But what's going to happen in the next few days is there will be pop-ups saying people that bought this book bought that book. Now, what Shoshana Zuboff points out in her book is this, that these companies are harvesting a great deal more than the information necessary to send you a book or even recommend another book, and they're selling it on. And it is a profound exploitation of your personal information, and it's making a huge amount of money without your permission. And she says that we need to rein this in very rapidly because it's happening. Now, you mentioned Alexa. I heard of a case where someone bought a robotic vacuum cleaner that roams around the sitting room, and a few days later, photographs appeared offering them new curtains and material because this thing is guided by pattern recognition cameras. It was photographing the inside of their house and sending it to these advertising agencies. Now, the difficulty with that is obvious, but it's even more frightening if you read what's happening, as we understand it, in Xinjiang among the Uyghur people, where this kind of facial recognition technology is being used to suppress, control, and deculturate an entire minor people's group. And that is very frightening. And the Time magazine article on it, which is well worth reading, written by a Chinese person, said at the end, look, all the technology needed to do this is in the West. The only difference is it's not in the hands of a centralizing power, but that could happen. The very next day, I read in the Times that some senior person in our police force said this is exactly what we need in London. And I think that illustrates the ethical problem beautifully. This is useful technology. A lot of us use it and are grateful for it, but it has a negative side. And therefore we have to decide. I don't personally have an Alexa for the reason that you've just explained, because much more is being monitored than we know. And I noticed that the next update with Apple is going to tell us when things on our smartphones are turned on, the camera and the microphone, by apps that we don't know are doing it.
Right.
So we've got a problem, and the ethics of it is not clear.
Well, look, I mean, we're going to move to some questions in just a moment's time, but you've painted quite a a worrying picture of what the future might hold. Do you have a reason for hope? Do you believe that there is a sort of a light at the end of that tunnel, that technological tunnel?
Well, all technological revolutions have brought problems, and they've brought gain. And I think Christians ought to be involved in this technology, actually. And I would encourage scientifically minded young people, because in the area of medicine, for example, vaccine for COVID-19, it's artificial intelligence is going through all kinds of combinations to determine that. And diagnostics has been hugely successful. X-rays and building those narrow artificial intelligence machines. But we've got to make it clear, another reason I wrote the book was to differentiate between the stuff that works and the stuff that is really still in the realm of science fiction. And narrow AI is very simple to define. It's one computer, a large computer with a large database and a program that recognizes patterns, and it does one single thing that normally requires human intelligence. And we must remember, this is artificial intelligence. That is, when we look at the diagnosis of an X-ray with an AI system, then it looks as if it's been done by an intelligent human, but the intelligence lies in the humans who programmed it and built the system. The system itself is not intelligent, it's not even conscious. And it's important to bear that in mind.
Yeah, ultimately an algorithm, however clever, does not equate to what is a human mind and a human...
No, it's about as conscious as Microsoft Word.
Well, look, it's great to have your thoughts on this, and there may well be questions that come up that relate to the issues you've raised in the book 2084.
Well, again, could I say that there's a website, 2084book.com.
Great, absolutely, 2084book.com if you want to find out more, and do check out the link to the book as well from the info with today's show as well. So we're going to go to some questions now, John, and they've been coming in thick and fast while we've been speaking. Let me just say again, very quick advert, that if you would like to hear more on a regular basis from Unbelievable, don't forget you can find it wherever you are, via the podcast, via the YouTube channel. And if you sign up to the newsletter, you'll get a free ebook thrown in as well. So there are links from the description if you want to get hold of that free ebook. Okay, let's go to some questions. What should we start with, Luce?
Yeah, I think a theme that's coming up a lot for people at the moment is, going back to the pandemic and where we find God in the midst of it all. And we've had a question that's come in from India. This is someone called Samuel Paul David, who says, faith is being shaken in this pandemic. How can one remain strong in such a long prevailing set of uncertainties? I'm from India. After this pandemic, there is a sudden uprising of people to denounce God because their loved ones and jobs are lost. What comfort can be given to such people? And how hard is it going to be to preach the gospel after this pandemic? Gosh, there's a lot in there.
Yes, there are at least 3 questions, and they're all very valid questions. And I think as we look at the pandemic, there are 2 perspectives on it. There's the perspective of people asking questions because they're fitting well and they see what's happening. But then there is the perspective of people who are suffering or who have been involved with family members and friends who are suffering. And we need to remember both of those. The first questions are intellectual, the second are pastoral, and people need comfort. But just let's look at some of your questions. People denouncing God. Well, that's an apparently easy solution. What I mean by that is the atheist way out just says, well, this is how the world is. It's hard luck if you suffer and somebody else doesn't. This is the kind of Dawkins view that the world as we see it is just what you'd expect if there's no good, no evil, and no purpose. But if that's true, of course, it's very odd to speak of the problem of evil. What I would say about that briefly is this, that it seems to be a way out, but actually it only removes at one level an intellectual problem. It certainly doesn't remove the suffering. But what it does remove is all possible hope, because the atheist view ends with death by definition. So you've got no hope. Now, I think Christianity has something to say. You mentioned in your question, quite rightly so, that people's faith gets shaken and they get wobbly and uncertain. Well, what the Christian message has to say to that, into that situation, is that the specter behind all of this is death. And the central Christian claim is that Jesus Christ has conquered death. He has risen from the dead. And not only that, the Christian message is that whoever trusts him, even if they die, yet they will live, as he told Mary and Martha at the graveside of their brother Lazarus. And that is what I cling on to. I do believe as a scientist that there's strong evidence that Jesus rose. I also believe it because it makes sense of my experience and has made sense all of my life. Now, if we can face this kind of thing with the knowledge that through trusting Christ, even if we die of COVID-19, we will one day be raised. Our life is not gone. We have an eternal dimension to life to look forward to. And that gives huge hope. And I find that a major stabilizing factor. So don't let yourself wobble too much. I think what's important is that you remind yourself and read in the Gospels the central truths of Christianity and compare them with the superficial, though understandable, reactions of people who denounce God and so on in this way.
Got another question here from Wesley Santos, who says, "Hi, John. How should you approach today's high school kids with little or no basic knowledge of the Bible, but loads of atheistic and naturalistic assumptions obtained through school and the internet? How do we begin speaking to our young people who, in a sense, have so little biblical knowledge or awareness of Christianity, but an awful lot of naturalistic assumptions going on?"
Well, I'm very glad that the questioner is thinking of doing this, because it's enormously important. There's not a level playing field. And it's not only true of high school kids, it's true of adults as well. I meet many people, very highly educated, but they've only heard naturalism. They've only listened to people like Hitchens and so on. And I think the best way to start is where you are with those young people that you can get to. This is one of those questions that in a sense is unanswerable. We'd love to be able to deal with the whole world at once, but we can't. So what can we do? Individually, we can try to think through and grasp some of the answers to these questions. Many young people, you've put your finger on it yourself actually in your question, they simply don't know. Now, the word agnostic actually means that. I don't know. And a lot of agnosticism can be removed by bringing new knowledge. And that is why many Christians are so aware of what's in the Bible and all the rest of it, but they don't realize that these ideas and truths, people have never heard them. So start to explain them. And you'll have to do some work at this, but I'm glad you're thinking of it. And that is to try and find literature that you can pass on credibly. So you've got to read it yourself and understand it. To young people, point them to discussions. And I'm going to say something now that Justin didn't ask me to do, but the Unbelievable Show is a wonderful place to guide thinking young people. It is, in my estimation, one of the best radio shows, not only in the UK, but world around, on bringing differing worldviews together so that you hear both sides. And if you get a young person to listen to both sides of a discussion, then they'll talk to you about it. And you can educate them, you can give them more information, you can help them to better literature. But don't try and do it all at once. Try and answer one question at a time.
I'm very pleased to say that we've got questions coming in from people of lots of different worldviews on the comments. There's one here from someone who describes himself as an atheist-leaning agnostic, and in a moment we'll read you one from someone who's Jewish as well. But Jamie, first of all, says, I am an atheist-leaning agnostic. I watch loads of debates with intelligent atheists versus intelligent believers daily, and I always come out thinking the atheist has easily won the debate. I would love there to be a God, but I cannot do it. Any advice on how I open my mind up to the possibility of God? It might be another.
The easy answer to that is to watch Unbelievable.
You'd think I was paying you for this, John. But,
no, not at all. But you see, if you think the atheists always come out best, you're obviously not watching Unbelievable. So I would encourage you to do that. And it's not a question of persuading yourself. I'm a believer in God for several different reasons. I grew up in a Christian family. I first saw Christianity credible in my parents because they lived it. But then, of course, as I went through school and university, I faced all the questions. And my conviction of the truth of Christianity has been based on realizing that I started being agnostic about many things I didn't know. So I wanted to find out. And I spent my entire life up until this point making myself open and vulnerable to questioning, sometimes very hostile questioning, from people who don't share my worldview. Now, saying that you'd like there to be a God is very interesting, because that doesn't prove there isn't a God. And it doesn't prove there is a God. But there's a reaction in you that actually it supports one of the things I was reading yesterday in the Bible. God has set eternity in their hearts. There's a desire for something more. And of course, I don't know your situation, and I can't give a generic answer that will answer this question. I think you know that as well as I do. But what I would encourage you to do, if you haven't already done it, is to befriend some Christians who you respect and talk to them and ask your questions of them, because it's often in personal conversation, because not all the evidence for Christianity comes from arguing a case or answering difficult questions. Because if Christianity is true, it has got to have an effect on our lives at all levels, morally, ethically, and all the rest of it. It's got to produce peace, a sense of forgiveness, and all of that. And so if we simply are searching in one dimension, we might need to wake up to the fact that we're living in a three-dimensional or four-dimensional universe.
I'm currently working on a book on conversion, John, adult conversion. And what's interesting to me in so many of the cases is that there's a number of different elements that come together when someone changes their mind and has a radical change of worldview from atheism to Christianity. And it's frequently, it is an intellectual journey, but it might be married with some kind of potentially an emotional crisis, or some sort of event, at least, that sort of causes the different paths to come together and forces this change. And
or even an experience.
Indeed. Yeah. And to some extent, it would be wrong to simply categorize that process as just an intellectual thing. If I just watch more debates and just become convinced that the Christians have the better arguments, there's a lot more going on inevitably when someone changes their mind towards God rather than away from God, isn't there?
There is. And one of the reasons for that is God is a person, not a theory. And it's a bit like marriage. It's not a purely intellectual thing, although it involves that. It's relating to a person. And if we just go about it as a purely rational endeavor, it's going to be very thin. And therefore, it may even support atheism in the sense that it doesn't feel real. And I'm all against emotionalism, but I'm all for genuine emotion, which is a response to facts. And as a person responding to God, and one of the reasons the Christian faith deals with that uniquely is that its central claim is God has become human. in the person of Jesus Christ, and we can see how he lived and what he did, and his death and resurrection and so on. And we can relate to him.
We've got another question here. Do you want to, yes, do you want to ask this one, Luce? It's
Sorry.
there we go. Oh, it's a bit further down. Hang on.
Sorry.
Here we go.
Yes, we've had a question from someone called Howard. He says, being Jewish, I thought I could go directly to God for forgiveness, as in Yom Kippur, for example. I've heard from Christian friends that God is holy and cannot interact with sin. If that is the case, how is it that Christ could? Do I need Christ or God to forgive my sins? I'm glad you're answering this one, John.
Well, it's a lovely question, really. And my heart goes out to the questioner, because Yom Kippur was such a meaningful festival for the Jewish people, and it still is very meaningful. And it was a time when the temple was operating. It was a time when the high priest got nearer to God than ever he'd been before, in the sense that God had chosen that place to put his name there. And the high priest would make a sacrifice, and then he'd go into the immediate presence of God behind the big curtain in the temple. And for a few brief seconds, he stood there, and the people were praying outside, and then he came outside. And if he was still alive, they recognized that God had accepted him. Now, what is so interesting is that the New Testament, in a letter written particularly to people from Jewish background, which is called Hebrews, discusses all this and uses it as a very powerful thought model, because the high priest was only able to stay in the presence of God for such a short time, as you say, because of sin. He brought an animal sacrifice, but the problem isn't between animals and God, it's between humans and God. And the Christian claim, at least, is that Jesus took upon himself the role of the sacrifice that pays for sin and enables God to accept people like ourselves, you and me, who are sinners. Now, this is a spectacular thing, and it goes beyond all our thinking, and yet I am convinced it's true, because in the end, it really does work. So that when that high priest took an animal, killed it, and then appeared before God, that becomes a thought model for us. And when John the Baptist announced Jesus, he said, look, there's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And Jesus was crucified at Passover time. And the New Testament makes it clear that he fulfilled the role of the Passover lamb in Judaism. That is, it had been pointing forward for centuries to the reality that was in himself. So I would say to you, have a careful read at the book of Hebrews and ask your questions as you go through, because it deals very carefully and precisely with those questions. Why? Because the people to whom this book was written were asking exactly the same questions that you're asking. And therefore, I think you'll find answers there.
Another question here from David Tewson. He says, I like to believe that Jesus knew each of us personally when he died on the cross for us. Do you think that's possible? It's an interesting question.
We are limited by the capacity of our own minds. And yet there are occasions, particularly in mathematics, where there's an absolute genius who seems to remember every mathematical thing and can do calculations that he or she doesn't even understand how they do them. When we try to get our head round the idea that God became human, I think we begin to see that there's a huge mystery about the nature of the Lord Jesus, but he gave hints of it. For example, when he met Nathanael at the beginning of John's Gospel, he said something to him, and Nathanael said, "How do you know me?" And he said, well, I saw you sitting under your fig tree. Well, how did that happen? And I do think there's a very real sense in which the Lord knows all of us. Indeed, he said so. He said he calls his sheep by name. I am the good shepherd, and all this kind of thing. So that however difficult it is for us to comprehend that, although we're beginning to understand computers with very large memories that can remember the whole population of the world, essentially, I don't think we need to put that beyond God. So when you say you like to think he knows you personally, the answer to it is he does. And he loves you personally and individually. And so you can talk to him in prayer and know that you're being heard as an individual. And that's wonderful, you see, even in a time of pandemic. And people will read Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And he walks with us, he leads us to green pastures, and even in the valley of the shadow of death, he's there. So he is near to you. So don't say, I hope, or I would like. It is the fact that you can reckon on it and you can live according to it.
Fantastic. We have got questions on literally all kinds of different subjects coming in. And just a reminder, if you're watching and you'd like to put your question in for submission, plenty of time to do that if you want to leave it in the comments wherever you're watching the video from at the moment. But Teeny Collier says, is the book of Revelation an encrypted story? Which part should we take literally, if any? What should we take from it, apart from the bits we really like, of course? Now, the reason I've selected this question, John, is partly because I know that 2084, your latest book, does deal with questions around the book of Revelation and where the world is heading and with technology and so on, and sort of maybe starting to make some suggestions about how we might see some overlap between what's in Revelation and what we see happening in the world today. So I just thought this was an interesting question for you potentially to take up, as you've obviously
it's an extremely interesting question. How many hours have you got? I think I've also written, by the way, a book on Daniel which deals with this kind of question in its own right. It's called Against the Flow. But let's have a look at it. With any literature, we're faced with this question. We read in the Times, say, that Justin Brierley was flying down the road in his car. Now, would you take that literally? Well, now just be careful. Justin is literal, his car is literal. But the sentence contains a metaphor in the word flying. And at the base level, it isn't literal. But you would understand it perfectly well. You don't need it translated. It means he was driving very fast. So it's a metaphor that stands for a reality. Now, I learned that years ago from C.S. Lewis, but it's immensely helpful when it comes to the book of Revelation. And all I can do is give you one or two very brief examples. The natural thing to do, and the reformers stress this, of course, is to take things as they strike you at face level. So, for example, when Jesus said, I am the door, you don't take that literally, that he was made of metal, steel, or plastic, or wood. No, you realize that it's a metaphor, but again, it's a metaphor for something real. He's a real door into a spiritual experience of God. He's not a literal door. And the problem is with the word literal, it's almost useless. And let me give you an example in the book of Revelation. The vision, the very first vision, is a vision of 7 lampstands. And we're told that the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches of Asia. And you say, well, that solved it. That's just a bit of code. That now we know that every time we see a lampstand, we read church. But you see, that is exactly wrong, because it's not who they are, they're churches. It's what they are, what the churches are. So John is looking at the churches as lampstands. And what interests him is the way in which they're holding up the light of the Christian message. So we tend to look at it, it's a code. What does it mean? It's a church and we're finished. No, we're only started, because the metaphor is giving expression to what John wants us to understand. And that makes it fascinating, you see, because we now see that he's interested in increasing the intensity of the light proceeding from churches, which is a thing that some churches today ought to think about very seriously. So you can go through the book of Revelation and you can see this kind of thing. Now, there's only one thing in Revelation that really looks like a code. The number of the beast, you've probably heard of it. The number is 666. And the attempts to solve what it means have been all too successful all through history. It's a gematria. That is, in the ancient days, if a girl fell in love with somebody called Jim, she would add up the numerical value of the letters in his name and carve it in a tree. I love the boy whose number is 25, and everybody else would try and work out what that was. But you see, here's the interesting thing. Who that is in the book of Revelation, we don't know. And I don't even speculate, but I can tell you what it is, because the text tells us what it is. And what it is, it's the number of a man. So it's the symbol for a human being. And that, of course, is the most fascinating and slightly scary thing about it. But I'm not going to go into that anymore. But what you need to do is always, when you think this may be a metaphor, then ask yourself the question, what reality do I think it stands for? And that will help you solve many of these puzzles, and it will make the book of Revelation absolutely fascinating.
Thank you very much, John. So much more that could be said, but we'll park that one for the moment. We've got another question here on AI and that kind of thing. Okay. Do you want to read that one out?
Is this Carla?
Yes.
Okay, so Carla Perry says, Professor Lennox, does your book discuss the difference between who is human and that which is machine? A lot of television shows and movies are creating viewers who are sympathetic to ethics protecting the life of the AI.
Yeah, so I suppose a lot of our sci-fi now is all concentrated around this very popular idea, isn't it, John, that machine learning and consciousness could somehow have this moment where it suddenly becomes, genuinely like a human soul or consciousness, and even as Carla says there, this idea that we should actually treat artificial intelligence as having its own rights and so on, which is all fascinating stuff. I mean, I've watched a series called Westworld. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's all set in this theme park whereby these robots that get consciousness and suddenly they rebel against their human masters who are using them for entertainment and so on. I mean, a lot of people seem to think that is the direction things are going, don't they? That what we're being shown in the sci-fi is effectively what the future will look like in some form. What do you think? Do you think, as Carla says, that there is ultimately a difference between what human is and what machine can ever be, I suppose, in that way?
Well, I suspect that there is, but the direct answer to her question is yes, I do discuss it in my book, because this is in essence what's called the transhumanist project. And Harari is very clear about it, that there are two big goals for the 21st century. Number one is to abolish physical death as a technical problem, so that humans may die, but they won't have to. And number two is to enhance human happiness by enhancing our life experience by biogenetic engineering, by drugs, by all kinds of things. And that is a desire of many people. And what we've got to bear in mind, and I give you a selection in my book of voices that are for this and voices that are very much against it, because if we're going to treat ethically robots and that kind of thing, we have to enter into the field and discuss the biggest problem in this area, and that is the problem of consciousness. Because if an artificial general intelligence, the idea of that is that it'll be something, either a machine or enhanced human, that can do much and more in every area that a human being can do, not just in one area, but in every area. And if it's going to really seriously imitate human intelligence, it will have to be conscious. And here's the problem. No one knows what consciousness even is, let alone the capacity to build it. So I see a virtually insuperable barrier here. And if something isn't conscious, then it is a little bit problematic to make any sort of ethical description. The difficulty here is we get sentimental about certain things. We see these cuddly robotic toys and, oh, the dear little things, and this kind of reaction to them, you see. And people treat them as pets, and they don't soil the floor, and they never answer back and all this kind of stuff, and they're alert 24/7. And the danger is that we begin to think of them in anthropomorphic terms. We begin to change them into humans in that sense. What we need to be very careful of is the language that's being used in the whole field of artificial intelligence. And one of the most interesting papers I ever read on the topic, and I met the author who's now in his 80s, is the word artificial in the phrase artificial intelligence is real. And that's a very important thing to realize. But once we have the word intelligence in it, and as Justin has just said, machine learning, people begin to think, well, yes, it is intelligent because it simulates intelligence, but it isn't intelligent. And we're nowhere near. I have read a vast amount about this and talked to people around the world about it. We're nowhere near producing artificial life, let alone artificial consciousness, whatever that would mean. So in one sense, I don't think you need worry, but in another sense, we've already reached a stage with narrow artificial intelligence. That's the stuff that actually works, where it is having a profound 1984 type influence on our society. And it is the tool for repressive states. Vladimir Putin said a year or two ago, whoever leads in AI rules the world. And there's a lot of truth in that, because this technology is capable of enslaving people. And one of the things I address in the book are the various scenarios people have of the future. Some very serious physicists like Max Tegmark. All these scenarios, will a superintelligence, if we ever make it, be benevolent? Will it treat human beings as pets, or will it simply get rid of them as a nuisance? Will we be able to control it, and all this kind of stuff? Now, if people are thinking that way, what I want to say to them is this: if we're prepared to entertain that, why don't we have a look at a scenario that's described in the book of Revelation, subject of the previous question, but not only there, in the letters Paul wrote to the Thessalonians and also in the book of Daniel, a scenario there that talks about the future, and put it into the mix of our thinking to see whether Christianity is talking sense. So I devote part of my book in trying to do that. But, you know, when we read about artificial intelligence, it's always just round the corner, 40 years away. And it's been 40 years for as long as I've been thinking about these things. It seems to extend into the future, because people who know realize that we understand so very little about the life we already possess, let alone the consciousness and how the brain links to the mind. And all of these kind of things. So it's interesting, it's important enough that many of the leading thinkers in the world are very concerned about having some kind of international agreement about ethical norms as to what research we should allow, because there is a swelling opinion, if it can be done, it should be done. And the big danger is we'll start to meddle with the germline of human beings and we'll alter humanity irrevocably. And that could be an absolute catastrophe, as C.S. Lewis predicted.
Got other questions coming in. We'll move from the technological AI stuff to more of some of the classic questions around evidence for the existence of God and those kinds of debates that go on. I think you've got one here from Phil.
Yeah, there's a question here from Phil Nightingale, who says, can you help us with the best defense against the atheist claim that I don't need to prove God doesn't exist? The burden of proof is on the theist to prove that he does.
Well, there's a total misunderstanding lies behind that question. And it's that atheism is not a belief system, but it is a belief system. What has happened is that Richard Dawkins and Hitchens and a number of others have revised, in fact, they've redefined the concept of belief. And they think faith is believing where there's no evidence. So they say atheists have no faith. And they've come to believe that, which is rather oxymoronic and self-contradictory. You see, in the book where Dawkins says that atheists have no faith, he spends 400 pages explaining what he believes, what his faith is. Because the flip side of atheism, and what lies behind your question, is people say, well, I just don't believe there is a God. That's not a matter of faith. But what they don't tell you is, that is part of a whole belief system that we call naturalism or materialism. And that's why Dawkins' book is not 1 page long. I don't believe in God, full stop. The burden of proof is on you. No, he doesn't do that. Because the burden of proof is on both sides. We've got to have evidence for what we believe, or else we're a little bit gullible. And I find somebody said the burden of proof is on you to prove there is a God. I'm happy to respond to that by giving evidence, but I'm going to ask them what is their evidence for saying that there is no God. And if they refuse to answer that, they're putting themselves in a very weak intellectual position.
I have heard it said, just to extend this a little, and I'm very much in agreement with your position there, John, but sometimes the way atheism is defined, and I don't know if you've heard this, is as I simply lack belief in God. Therefore, it's not saying, it's essentially saying I don't have a belief, and therefore, because I lack this belief, I'm just have to wait until someone convinces me otherwise and gives me a belief one. And in a sense, I've always found that kind of collapses into a sort of agnosticism, a sort of
oh yes, it does. That isn't atheism. You're absolutely right. That's agnosticism. I lack belief is essential to say I don't know. And when I meet agnostics like that, and they tell me I'm an agnostic, I lack belief. So I say to them, look, I'm an agnostic too. There are lots of things I don't know. So please tell me what you don't know, and I might be able to help you, and you might be able to help me with what I don't know. It's this idea that agnostic is a sort of supreme position that nobody else shares. And if a person says, I don't know, and then moves on to say, you can't know, I said to them, well, if you don't know, how can you know that I don't know?
It sounds like a riddle. Here's another one that's come in on the question of science and the beginning of the universe specifically. Greg asks, I've heard many prominent atheists say that if we give science more time, that a solid explanation for the beginning of the universe will be established. What would you say to someone who makes such an assertion?
But explanations come at different levels. The point is, science has given us an explanation in the sense of the standard model of physics. And it talks about the Big Bang beginning and what subsequently happened and all that kind of thing. Science itself, at least the current views, are that the laws of nature that we observe break down at a singularity at the beginning. So you can't have a scientific explanation of that. But I think often that question comes from the fact that we don't quite get our head around the fact that explanation doesn't only occur in a scientific sense. I often illustrate that by saying, why is the water boiling? And people say, well, it's because the heat is agitating the molecules of water in a kettle, and that's why it's boiling. Well, that's a good scientific explanation. But it's actually boiling because at this point in this interview, I'd love a cup of tea, you see. Now, that's an agent explanation in terms of my desire. It doesn't conflict with the scientific explanation. It doesn't compete with it. It complements it. And what you're saying is this: will science find out more about the beginning? Highly probably, and it'll be fascinating to see it when it does. But that's not an argument against the God explanation, because the God explanation is not the same kind of explanation. I often say to people, look, science and God no more compete as explanation for the universe than Henry Ford and the law of internal combustion compete as an explanation for a motor car engine. We need to realize that science is powerful because its explanatory power focuses on a certain kind of questions. And the questions it doesn't deal with actually are the most important questions, questions of meaning. So science will go on, and we may find out more and more, but that doesn't remove God, because he's not a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Not at all. God's the God of the whole show, the bits we do understand and the bits we don't.
John, we're going to change tack just slightly now. Many churches, ours included, we've had to go online in a much bigger way than we were already in these last few months. And we've certainly experienced that in our church. And there's a question that's coming from Mark Gilmore, who was wondering what your thoughts were on how Christians should handle social media, YouTube, and other addictive algorithmic platforms. How can we use these platforms well for our purposes?
Because in a way they can suck us in as well, can't they? You know, they're there to keep eyeballs on screens essentially, and that's not always very productive or very healthy for us, frankly, in the end.
Oh, it isn't, particularly for young people. If you read the works of the psychologists, we are in danger of rewiring our brains and developing very short attention spans, which some people may even notice in church as a result of this. So my response to it, if it's sucking you in, then practice a good Christian virtue, which is called electronic fasting. And I think it's something that some people need to do, because if a person is watching a screen 6, 8, 10 hours a day, of course it's doing something to them. They'll fail in the end to distinguish between the world they see on the screen and what we would now call the real world. Although some of them call it the real world, as I understand from psychological research. So these are tools to be used. The danger with anything we use, which is fascinating, that it becomes not a servant but a master. And if it begins to control us so that we've got to see the latest YouTube video and so on. Look, we all need time for thought and reflection and quiet spaces. And in the Bible, there was a wonderful Jewish institution called Shabbat, taking a day of rest. And it's no rest if you're watching something on a screen all your time. We need to give it up, start reading a real book. If you've seen one in the last while, they do still exist. And go outside and get a good walk and get involved in nature and so on. I mean, one could go on, but there is a very real danger. I have found, here we are involved with Zoom or something like that. These are very useful platforms, and they're helping many people who are locked in simply to have company. And from my perspective as a communicator, they are immensely powerful and helpful. I've been already today, had an interview with America and 2 more in Australia. Well, you can't do that normally, but now we've got the technology. So it's using it, but realizing that if it's beginning to take over and you're not sleeping very well, which is a very good indicator, then you're probably watching too much of a screen too late at night. And of course, it's fatal to take it to bed with you, but I'm sure you don't want me to become a horrible old uncle and tell you things like that.
No, it's very, very wise advice, John.
I think as parents of teenagers as
absolutely.
well, it's you know,
yeah.
it's a daily concern.
I mean,
Yes.
I'm old enough that I didn't actually grow up with screens constantly around me, but our children have grown up as they call them, digital natives, and they have never been in a world where they didn't have immediate access to the internet and to screens and so on. And I think we're navigating for the first time how we parent and how we raise children in a psychologically healthy way when there is a completely new world that they're being born into.
Right.
And it's no easy task, but there are resources out there. Our time has come almost to a close all too quickly, John. I want to thank you again for the time you've given us today. We've got one more question that we'll throw at you in a moment, but just before we do that, I just want to remind people that if you want to get hold of John's book 2084, which we've obviously referenced in some of these questions, it's available at the website 2084book.com. But you can also find a link from the video here where you can purchase the book and get hold of it for yourself. If you get the Audible version, you'll hear my own voice narrating it. So I don't know if that's going to make you want to buy it or not. But in any case, that's the place to go. And again, if you enjoy what you're hearing and watching today on the show, do subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast and YouTube channel, and indeed the newsletter. And just a reminder, we've got the info there on the video. If you want to subscribe to the newsletter, you'll get a free ebook sent your way as well, with some fascinating conversations I've had with some leading thinkers across the atheist and Christian divide. So we've got a final question.
We've got one final question. This is from Gen, who says, how do you convince somebody who believes that they are a good person that they still have need for God?
There were people like that at the time of the New Testament. And there always will be people like that. I think one of the advices that C.S. Lewis gave on that question was, just try hard to live with the Sermon on the Mount for a week and then ask yourself the question again. Because when we compare ourselves with the stature of Jesus Christ and his behavior, we all fall short. Now, that's not to say we're not good. We're not good parents and good people. Jesus never stated that we weren't. He pointed out that we do all kinds of things. We love our children and all this kind of stuff. But when measured by the standard of God, all of us surely have to confess, because it's not simply how we behave towards others that is the measure of goodness and morality. It's how we behave towards God. And the number one commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Have you done that? Because if you haven't, you're not perfect. There's no question about it. And I haven't, certainly not. And therefore, the measure of real goodness, because once a youngish person approached Jesus and said, "Good teacher," and he says, "Good? There is no one good but God." Now you need to think about that in connection with your question. Do you really think you're as good as God? And has your goodness shown itself? The point is that God recognizes good deeds. There's a famous story in the book of Acts of one of the first non-Jews who became a Christian. His name was Cornelius. He was a Roman citizen, and he was very generous before he became a Christian. And Peter was sent to him, the Apostle Peter, and explaining the Christian faith to him in his house, he said to Cornelius, "Your prayers and your alms have come up before God. What you're doing, really, God loves it. He thinks it's terrific." But during that interview, Cornelius discovered that he also needed salvation, because although he was in that sense a good chap, and we would all have been happy to know him and have liked him, he wasn't a person that didn't need forgiveness. We all need forgiveness. And therefore, there are two sides to this. And perhaps you're reacting, and of course I don't know you, so I may be wrong, but perhaps you're reacting to Christians who said that nobody does any good. Well, that isn't true. The Lord himself recognized Cornelius's goodness, but compared with God, we all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And in that sense, we're not good. And we need God's salvation and forgiveness, which he freely offers us. So I don't think there's a difficulty in reconciling what you're sensing with what the New Testament. God loves what you do that's good, but do remember that will never save you, because salvation is not on the basis of merit. That's a religious view that's common around the world, that salvation, like everything else in life, depends on merit. The wonderful thing about Christianity that makes it unique is that salvation is granted to people who cannot merit it, like me. And that is why one of the main reasons I am a Christian, because Jesus offers me something that no other religion or philosophy offers me. That is forgiveness, peace with God, on the basis not of my merit or goodness, but of the fact that Christ has done something for me, that if I accept it, then I receive peace with God, forgiveness, and eternal life. And that is where my hope is placed. It would be a very risky thing to place your hope in your own goodness, because if God starts assessing me, I'll not speak for you, you have to answer that for yourself, then I would come very far short of his standards.
Funny thing is, John, that we preached on the story of Cornelius on Sunday in our church,
wonderful.
in our church service, and we talked about some of the things you've just been sharing, and about the fact that God loves us so much that he doesn't want to leave us as we are.
Yes,
he wants
exactly right.
To draw us ever closer to him. Yeah, and Cornelius was good, but Jesus had so much more to offer him.
That's correct.
And if you could see, John, next door to where we're filming this in our sitting room, we have a whole puppet stage erected, which we use every Sunday as part of our family time. And we're going through the stories of Acts all the way through. With
wonderful.
So we had the whole of the story of Cornelius acted out with puppets on Sunday as well.
Oh, well, I'm glad I mentioned it.
Yeah.
There you go. It's been such a pleasure to spend some time with you, John. Thank you so much. And thank you for the fact that you are just offering yourselves to so many people during this time as well, from your study, connecting with people all over the world. It's just wonderful to be able to spend some time. And I hope that all the people who've been watching have appreciated it. Many, many more questions here than we obviously were able to ask. But thank you, everyone who has sent in questions. And we'll continue to look at them, and perhaps they'll feed into future editions of the show as well. But for now, can I remind you again, do check out the links to John's book from the description. Do feel free to subscribe to the Unbelievable newsletter as well. You'll get the free ebook, and of course, listen to the show. You'll hear many episodes with John featured in conversation with lots of interesting people over the last several years. So, John, to you and Sally, thank you very much for the time, and God bless you.
Well, thanks to both of you very much. It's lovely to have been interviewed by such a delightful pair. And let me just reiterate, don't be unbelieving about unbelievable. Believe in it and watch it. Thank you very much, and good night.
Good night, John.
God bless you, John. God bless you. And thank you very much for watching. Looking forward to seeing what goes on in all the comments after this. We will be airing this show again on our YouTube channel via our podcast and the radio station. So you'll be able to watch back at any time as convenient to you. But for now, thank you very much for being part of our live stream, and we'll say goodbye. For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.